Shalom Aleichem. Welcome. A gute Woche. Ich heiße Vivian Felsen und es ist mein großes Vergnügen, euch zu begrüßen im Namen von Komitee für Yiddish bei der Toronto UGA Federation. My name is Vivian Felsen, and it is my great pleasure to welcome you today on behalf of the Toronto UGA Federation. I am safely here in Toronto with Sharon Power, another member of our Committee for Yiddish, who is, as always, behind the scenes ensuring that everything runs smoothly. But we are here safe in Toronto, but our guest speaker today, and Miri Corral, who is our co-presenter, are both in Los Angeles. And it's been a little bit touchy to even know if we could go forward today with our program, but everything seems to be okay. And our guest speaker very thoughtfully pre-recorded his lecture, which will be shown today because he was afraid that there might be a power failure. So I think we're all set for today's lecture. So I would like to introduce to you Miri Corral of the Cycle, who will then introduce our guest speaker, whom she knows very well. Miri, as you've probably heard before from the other programs that we've presented together, is the founder and director of the California Institute for Yiddish Culture and Language. She's a popular Yiddish teacher. She's a professor at UCLA. She's a writer. She's involved in theater. She does many, many things. And it's really my pleasure now to introduce Miri Corral.
Thank you so much, Vivian. And I want to thank you and the Toronto UJA Committee for Yiddish, and of course, Sharon Power, our technical mavente, as you mentioned, Vivian, who's behind the scenes helping with the webinar hosting. Both of you and the committee are what make this program possible. And I also, just before I give you my formal remarks, or as we say in Yiddish, let me take a few minutes before I actually begin speaking, that we will have live, because Mark is with us, the Q&A session after our talk. So even though he did the right thing in pre-recording the talk itself, he will be able to respond to your questions at the end in real time. And as Vivian mentioned, I also really need to take a moment to acknowledge that the LA region is, as you know, in a severe crisis mode. The level of destruction and displacement in this most populous county in America is horrifying and mind-boggling. All of us here are either directly or indirectly affected by this massive destruction. Either we ourselves or friends and loved ones are refugees, and many have already lost their havens, their homes, and all material possessions. So may we take comfort today in this extraordinary cultural heritage that has endured through many, many traumas and calamities. And I do want to give a shout out on a happy note to my UCLA students, many of whom are attending this webinar today. I'm so glad you could make it. And also to announce, Mil Hashem, that on March 6th, the Toronto and California have a further collaboration in presenting an amazing shmuas conversation with renowned performer Mike Burstein, who will share his memories of the great Yiddish theater of which he was a part since childhood. Now, I'm really, really honored and happy to introduce our speaker today, who, by the way, has been a special guest a number of times for the Yiddish Institute in the past. Mark Smith is one of those highly unusual people who arrived at a fork in the road and decided to take both of them at once. As if a successful 30-year career in architecture was not enough, his readings of works by Yiddish historians inspired him to pursue in tandem a doctorate in history at UCLA, which he completed in 2016, and to turn out a highly acclaimed book, The Yiddish Historians and the Struggle for a Jewish History of the Holocaust, which was published by Wayne State University Press in 2020, and became a National Jewish Book Award finalist. I think the only way he could have done this, I mean, maintain his architecture career, aside from having prodigious mental faculties, is by not sleeping. Mark is a resident scholar at American Jewish University in Los Angeles and has taught Jewish history at his alma mater, UCLA. He also writes and lectures on East European Jewish history with a special interest in Holocaust historiography, I probably pronounced that wrong, and Yiddish scholarly writing. His current and forthcoming articles on Yiddish historians appear in Holocaust and Genocide Studies on historian Joseph Wolf, Studia Rosenthaliana on Yiddish studies of Dutch Jewish history, and in East European Jewish affairs on Soviet Jewish scholars. He's also on the editorial board of Perspectives, the magazine of the Association for Jewish Studies, and at the annual Association of Jewish Studies conference, he recently delivered a paper called The Yiddish Encyclopedia as Prescription for the Future, because it turns out the encyclopedia has a surprisingly progressive worldview. He'll also be speaking at the YIVO Centennial Conference this June in New York on the subject of YIVO and Holocaust research. Today's talk is directly related to the book he is currently working on, which is a companion volume of translations of Yiddish historians' writings from before and after the Holocaust. And that book is forthcoming from Academic Studies Press this year, 2025. It's also worth noting that Mark and I have been friends for, well, over 30 years, having been members of the local Lehenkreis, the reading circle that bore the incredible fruit of two Yiddish cultural organizations, the California Yiddish Institute, known as CYCLE, and Yiddishkeit LA, as well as a Yiddish historian of Yiddish historians, Mark Smith. One of CYCLE's many seminal projects was to digitize and create online access through UCLA's digital library of all 150 issues of the Yiddish literary magazine of the LA Yiddish Culture Club, Cheshbon, or Reckoning. And Mark completed an online translation of the entire first volume of Cheshbon. So you see, there's no way this man ever sleeps. It's my great pleasure to introduce Dr. Mark Smith.
Thank you very much, and greetings to everyone here in Los Angeles and Toronto and beyond. I've been asked to share a few thoughts with you about my current project. When I began to read Jewish history in Yiddish, I found that I had entered a world that was eigenartig, to use a Yiddish word that in this case means unique in itself. I discovered a community of scholars with shared goals and common interests who carried on a lively conversation across the continents and an equally lively critique of each other's works. At that time, around the year 2000, this community was almost within reach. Most of the historians were still within the living memory of their students and other active scholars. This is, alas, no longer the case. With the eventual decline of secular Yiddish language scholarship and its audience, little memory of the thousands of historical works written in Yiddish remains to be transmitted outside that cultural world. Most of their works are still untranslated and known only to specialists. Why read Jewish history in Yiddish? Or, more to the point, why write Jewish history in Yiddish? And more specifically, why in the early 20th century did certain Jewish scholars in Eastern Europe turn to writing in a language that was barely respectable, for journals so newly established they had no scholarly reputation, to advance an enterprise that could offer no professional advancement? The answer lay in the excitement of a new venture, close to the heart. Never before in Jewish history had professional Jewish historians turned to writing the history of their own people in their own daily Jewish language for a readership consisting of the people themselves. Their goal was to construct the creation narrative for a borderless, Yiddish-speaking nation in Eastern Europe and its worldwide dispersion. My own purpose is to make Yiddish historical scholarship accessible to the non-specialist. My previous book, The Yiddish Historians and the Struggle for a Jewish History of the Holocaust, attempts to recreate the world of those survivors who wrote Holocaust history in Yiddish as professional historians. In a sense, it was a sequel to a book not yet written, namely the story of Yiddish historical writing before the Holocaust. I am currently finishing a companion volume that covers the entire period of modern historical writing in Yiddish, spanning most of the 20th century. It is an anthology of 49 works, translated into English for the first time, each with its own introduction and an opening essay. It is expected to appear later in the year. This talk is a preview of that volume. Today, in the 21st century, when the spirit of the times demands that the Ashkenazi narrative of Jewish history be given less emphasis in favor of neglected parallel histories, the Yiddish historians should be introduced as revolutionaries in their own context. The rise of every historiographical movement is a reaction against the prevailing historiography, and theirs was the protest movement of its time on behalf of the Yiddish-speaking Jews of Eastern Europe, whose culture and language had been neglected or disparaged in 19th century Germany by the historians of the Wissenschaft des Judentums tradition, in particular Heinrich Gretz. The Yiddish historians' goal was to write the history of a living people, and they addressed themselves to their readers in their own language. Their style is professional, but not impersonal. They join their readers in the collective narrative, using such expressions as "when one speaks among us Jews," or "the dim caverns of our past," and "a radical turning point in our 2,000-year history," or "the mental and spiritual life of our folk masses," and "Yiddish, which made us the object of jokes and laughter among the peoples of the world," and, as historian Meir Balaban promised, "I will draw the Yiddish reader into the circle of our past in Poland." Like the historians of many subjugated groups, Jewish historians who found their calling in writing about the Jews of Eastern Europe did so not only to reach their chosen audience, but as a means of placing themselves and their readers at the center of their own history. Jewish historical writing in Eastern Europe followed the pattern typical of such groups, with works written first by outsiders in foreign high culture languages, chiefly Russian and Polish, then by insiders writing in those same languages as a mark of cultural emulation, and finally by insiders demanding the use of their own languages. In Poland, however, this last stage gave rise to traditions in two languages, Polish and Yiddish. A Polish Jewish tradition of historical scholarship flourished before the Holocaust among historians who promoted a Polish Jewish national consciousness. A Polish Jewish tradition of historical scholarship flourished before the Holocaust among historians who promoted a Polish Jewish national consciousness. Its chief figures were Meir Balaban and Ignaz Schor. Within the Ashkenazi frame of reference, it was a particular view of Jewish history, in contrast to the universal view of the Yiddish historians. The particular view has become better known, but it was the minority position in its time. The majority of historians who wrote Ashkenazi Jewish history during the interwar period were partisans for a universal Ashkenazi diaspora nationalism, as expressed through Yiddish language and culture. A few historians participated to some degree in both efforts. And yet, no matter how earnestly the Polish Jewish orientation may have been held by certain Jewish historians, for those who left Poland, whether before or after the Holocaust, it evaporated upon their departure, and they turned to writing almost exclusively in Yiddish and the languages of their new countries. A third competing vision for the Jewish future was promoted by Zionism, with its Hebrew orientation. In addition to their support for diaspora nationalism, most historians who wrote in Yiddish in the early 20th century were also Zionists and were capable in Hebrew. Prior to the Holocaust and the creation of the State of Israel, however, they considered the possibility of a revived Hebrew-speaking nation remote, and they presumed that most Jews would remain in the diaspora with Yiddish as their common language. Modern historical writing in Yiddish can be dated from an article published in 1903 by Saul or Scheuel Ginsberg, one of the founders and editors of Der Freund, The Friend, the first daily Yiddish newspaper in Russia. It is the earliest Yiddish historical work I have found that is written, albeit somewhat quaintly, with the voice and craft of the modern historian. Quote, "In a few days it will be 200 years since St. Petersburg was founded, and we consider it not unwarranted to acquaint our readers with a few facts about the history of Jews in the Russian capital city." End quote. Ginsberg assembles his materials, uses them to recount a few key episodes, and footnotes them to their sources. Gone are the pathos and legendary incidents employed by pre-modern Hebrew Yiddish historians like his contemporary Ezrael Nathan Frank in Poland. Absent are the drama, predestination, and hand of the Almighty to be found in works by Gretz. But present is the living Jewish history of Eastern Europe. His obvious purpose is to demonstrate the contributions of Jews to early St. Petersburg, or more precisely, Jewish converts who found high positions with Peter the Great, when in his own time the city was still legally closed to nearly all Jews. Before Ginsberg and other historians could offer more than occasional works in Yiddish, they required readers accustomed to historical writing in Yiddish, beyond the journalism and literature that had become widespread in the last third of the 19th century. Such an audience for historical writing arose through ancillary genres, works by journalists and other non-historians on natural history, non-Jewish history, and also Jewish history, but all based on secondary sources rather than original research, as well as Yiddish translations of works by historians such as Simon Dubnov and Gretz. Dubnov, widely recognized as the father of East European Jewish historical scholarship, opened his first translated volume, published in 1909 in Vilna, with the statement, quote, "It has already long been my fervent wish to convert my general Jewish history written in Russian and give it to the Jewish people in their own living language," end quote. And he uses the term Megayer sein for conversion to Judaism. By 1926, Ignaz Schipper, one of the founding figures of Jewish historical writing in Poland, introduced his own first book in Yiddish more confidently, quote, "The strong interest that the Jewish reading public evinced in recent years regarding serious scholarly works in Yiddish made clear to the author that the time for which he had waited so long had become ripe." The timeline of Yiddish historical writing begins with a few important works in the early years immediately before World War I, finds its greatest accomplishments between the world wars, and sees a resurgence in productivity for more than 20 years after the Holocaust from within the survivor community. Geographically, Yiddish historical works were written before World War I, primarily in St. Petersburg, between the World Wars, largely in Poland, the Soviet Union, and the United States, and after the Holocaust, chiefly in Poland, Israel, the United States, and for local history, Argentina. Institutionally, the principal center of Yiddish historical writing was the Yiddish Scientific Institute, YIVO, founded in 1925 in Berlin, but located in Vilna, then in Poland, today Vilnius, Lithuania, with a major branch in New York, also founded in 1925, and smaller branches in Paris and Buenos Aires. YIVO served as a shadow university for scholarship in Yiddish, assembling a library and archives, holding academic conferences, offering a graduate student program, and most widely known, publishing journals and books in Yiddish. In 1940, the New York branch was transformed into the new YIVO headquarters, which it remains. It is worth noting that of the 9 founding members of YIVO, their places of origin were Ukraine, 3, Lithuania, 3, Latvia, 2, and Poland, 1. Many of the selections I have chosen to translate are by scholars associated to some degree with YIVO. One of them, Warsaw-born historian Jacob, or Yankov Schatzky, a co-founder of the New York branch, affirmed YIVO's transnational mission in 1932, saying, quote, "YIVO is not Vilna and not even Poland. YIVO is a matter for all Jews in the entire world." Other important centers of Yiddish historical scholarship also operated in Eastern Europe, 2 before the Holocaust in Soviet Minsk and Kiev, at the official Belarusian and Ukrainian academies founded in 1921 and 26, respectively, and another in post-war Poland at the Central Jewish Historical Commission, founded in 1944 in Lublin and reorganized in 1947 as the Jewish Historical Institute in Warsaw. They all enjoyed relative freedom of academic inquiry until the imposition of Stalinist dictatorship in the Soviet Union in 1929 and in Poland in 1949. In each, the change was marked by denunciations of suspected Jewish nationalists and attacks on former colleagues in the West. In pre-war Minsk and Kiev, even scholars who had attempted a materialist and class-conscious approach to their work were ultimately denounced, purged, and exiled or executed in the 1930s. In post-war Warsaw, scholars learned the art of falsifying scholarship to satisfy imposed masters to safely continue their work. Much valuable historical research was produced in each of these locations under extreme conditions, but it belongs to a different tradition of writing and reading. As a result, my translations are limited to those centers' early periods, except for a posthumous work by Ber Mark, longtime director of the Jewish Historical Institute in Warsaw. The term Yiddish historians refers to writers of Jewish history who chose to work to a significant degree in Yiddish. None wrote exclusively in Yiddish, and all functioned in multilingual settings. For Jewish historians to work in languages other than Yiddish was not remarkable. It was the choice of Yiddish that carried both meaning and hardship. Approximately 36 scholars chose, to a notable degree, to participate in the Yiddish National Project by writing Jewish history. Most were educated as historians, but in an era when professional boundaries were less formal than today, some had been trained in fields as diverse as law, chemistry, and medicine, while others came from related disciplines, such as literature or art, and wrote on the historical aspects of those fields. All of the figures whose works I have translated were connected to one or more of the others, as a teacher, student, colleague, critic, or participant in common institutions, research projects, or publishing venues. Through their writings, they conducted a worldwide conversation with each other and their readers in a network of scholarly and lay Yiddish journals published in Europe and America. Yet it should also be noted that only one of these historians, Balaban, was able to obtain a university position in Jewish studies before the Holocaust. Most of the others worked as teachers in Jewish secondary schools. In pre-revolutionary St. Petersburg, Zinberg was a chemical engineer at a manufacturing plant, and Ginsberg was the secretary of the Society for Promotion of Enlightenment Among the Jews. After the Holocaust, Isaiah Trunk and Yosef Kermish were chief archivists at YIVO and Yad Vashem, respectively, and Philip Friedman served as director of the Jewish Teachers Seminary and People's University in New York, the only institution in America that granted doctorates for dissertations written in Yiddish and Hebrew. Mark Dvorzhetsky was a medical doctor in the Israeli Health Service, who ultimately succeeded in creating and then holding the world's first chair in Holocaust history at Bar-Ilan University in 1959. Here are pictures of some of the people whose works I'm discussing today. In their methods, they were positivist historians who believed that sufficient spadework would reveal the past. Their ideal research paper was one, quote, based on archival sources, end quote, that would add another Ziegel zu dem Binyan, brick for the edifice, of historical knowledge. For them, such bricks resembled the missing pieces of a puzzle, rather than building blocks to be arranged in novel interpretations. None attempted a grand history in the manner of Gretz or Dubnov. All were committed to smaller studies that would facilitate an eventual synthesis. Perhaps because they were studying a past so closely related to their present, they had no doubt that truth could be objectively ascertained, and they would likely have been puzzled by the postmodernists' allegations of subjectivity and ineffability. Yet they were not primitives, as Elias Cherikover once labeled the medieval Yiddish and Hebrew chroniclers. They were historians of their own day. Some, like Raphael Mahler and Emanuel Ringelblum, were committed to Marxist economic materialism. Others, like Friedman and Balaban, were decidedly not. Ginsberg quoted Herder. Trunk and Nachman Blumenthal cited Ranke. Most held a doctorate or master's degree in history and were among the Yiddish intellectual elite before and after the Holocaust. They were frequently invited to write for leading non-academic journals and to speak on the radio and at significant public events. The Hebrew translation of Dvorzhetsky's Yiddish History of the Vilna Ghetto received the first Israel Prize in Social Science in 1952. The English version of Trunk's study of the Judenrat, the Jewish Councils, received the National Book Award for History in 1973. Before the Holocaust, the chief characteristics of the Yiddish historical tradition were that it was a modern secular enterprise of historical scholarship focused largely on the positive internal aspects of Jewish history, rather than on anti-Semitism or Jewish legal rights and disabilities. Dedicated to strengthening Jewish peoplehood and drawing in part on popular sources of historical information, with a reciprocal obligation to serve an educated lay readership. Their writings were often directed at a general audience, in popular as well as scholarly publications, and their academic journals were supported largely by lay readers around the world. For example, in 1935, when there existed only a few hundred Yiddish-oriented scholars in history and other disciplines combined, the principal YIVO journal, YIVO Blätter, Pages, published in Vilna, had 1,231 subscribers, nearly two-thirds of whom lived in the United States, followed by Poland, Argentina, South Africa, Lithuania, and Australia. The Yiddish historian's positive approach to Jewish history predated the well-known appeal by Salo Baron in 1928 to, quote, break with the lachrymose theory, as he put it, of Jewish history. For example, the imperative for such an approach was recognized by Jacob Schatzky in the 1925 Yiddish essay that he wrote on Jewish memoir writing. He notes that only extraordinary events such as wars, pogroms, or expulsions inspired people to write memoirs, and he asks, to whom would it have occurred to write a memoir about an age of quiet, peaceful, secure Jewish collective life? Have we not had such times? Certainly we have, in nearly every country. And turning to his most familiar locale, he concludes, such a form of golden age existed among the Jews in Poland, with their own parliament, with a disciplined organization that had a broad, deep, rich scope in every aspect of life. Where is that picture immortalized in memoirs by a Polish Jew of the time. A deliberately anti-lachrymose approach was announced by Elias Cherikover, the founding head of YIVO's historical section, in his 1929 preface to the first volume of YIVO's Historische Schriften, historical writings, in which he declares that its articles, quote, resound not with persecutions and evil decrees, without which it is altogether impossible to imagine Jewish history, but principally with the rise of the major Jewish communities and their representative bodies, with internal life and the social conditions among Jews in various countries, end quote. Writing Jewish history also had urgent practical purposes. As Emanuel Ringelblum wrote in his introduction to Trunk's 1939 History of the Jews of Plotzk, this book appears at a time when the rights of the Jewish population in Poland are being disputed. From the pages of Trunk's book, we learn the importance of Jewish participation in the economic development of the city, end quote. Such instrumental use of Jewish history made the historian, in Schatzky's words, quote, the ammunition supplier in the fight for Jewish rights in interwar Poland, providing facts and arguments to prove the antiquity and value of the Jews' presence in Poland. A subtler purpose is found in the study of Old Yiddish texts. They provide the literary pedigree for a modern Yiddish-speaking nation. Works such as the Meisebuch and the Zehnerene from the turn of the 17th century are lifted from their former status as incidentally Yiddish writings in a sea of multilingual Jewish creativity to serve as links in a historical chain of specifically Yiddish national expression. That so few of the authors are women reflects four phenomena. The older generations of Yiddish historians born between 1860 and 1900 included no women. In the younger generation, active before the Holocaust, women typically published, or were published, less often than men. In the same group, a greater proportion of women died at the hands of the Germans. For example, among the young historians' circle in Warsaw, 12 of the 24 men survived, but only 2 of the 11 women. And in the post-war period, women who might have had independent careers subsumed them to those of their husbands. For example, Esther Mark, wife of Beermark, completed his final volume in his name. Ada June Friedman, wife of Philip Friedman, completed his final book under the name Mrs. Philip Friedman. I am grateful to be able to include works by 2 of the more accomplished women of the pre-war period, Bella Mandelsberg and Dina Jaffe, both of whom were killed by the Germans, and by 2 women who continued their careers in the post-war period, Rachel Wischnitzer and Rachel Auerbach. Here are photos of a few more of the people I'm discussing. The absence of works from the Orthodox sector is explained by the traditional Jewish reluctance, still prevalent in the early 20th century, to engage in historical writing, as either a waste of time or an imitation of non-Jewish values. Although most of the Yiddish historians had varying degrees of traditional religious education, all embraced the writing of Jewish history as a modernizing secular project. The outstanding exception was Rabbi Shimon Huberband, a close colleague of Emanuel Ringelblum in the Warsaw Ghetto, whose complete writings in Yiddish were preserved and have been previously published in both Hebrew and English translations. Before World War II, there were only 2 significant exceptions to the Yiddish historian's positive approach to Jewish history. A series of articles by Ginsburg on the Cantonists, the Jewish boys forced to serve in the Russian army during the mid-19th century, and works by Cherikover on the pogroms in Ukraine after World War I. In a well-known address to YIVO in 1941, Cherikover had discussed the difficulty of applying modern historical methods to recurring catastrophe, but without proposing concrete solutions. It happens that both historians found a safe refuge in the United States, but died before the advent of Holocaust historiography, Ginsburg in 1940 and Cherikover in 1943. During the Holocaust, Yiddish historians met varying fates. Zinberg had already died in Soviet captivity during the Stalinist purges. The best-known victims of the Germans were Dubnov, who was killed in the Riga ghetto, and Ringelblum, conductor of the secret Einig Shabbos project in the Warsaw ghetto. Historians of the older generation, Schipper and Balaban, died so-called natural deaths in the ghetto. Among Ringelblum's associates, Rachel or Rochel Auerbach was one of the few survivors. The literary historian Meir Wiener died fighting in the Soviet army. Several historians, including Mark and Rachel Vishnitzer, escaped from Europe to America. Regarding the survivors who became Holocaust historians, Friedman and Kermisch each survived underground during the German occupation with the help of Christian friends. Trunk and Blumenthal fled east to the Soviet Union. Dvorzhetsky survived the Vilna ghetto and several concentration camps. Dvorzhetsky would later say of the survivors that non-Jews returned to their families, but Jews returned only to their people. After the Holocaust, the survivors and the intellectual heirs of the pre-war Yiddish historical tradition continued to study the internal aspects of Jewish history, but with a new subject, the German occupation. Transformed into Churbenforschung, catastrophe research, as Friedman called it, the pre-war tradition re-emerged as an imperative to write about everyday life in the ghettos and camps. Most defiantly, their topic was Jewish life and the struggle to sustain it, rather than Jewish death and its perpetrators. The question of questions, for which they felt the public demanded answers, was, how could this have happened to us? In one of their most lasting contributions to Holocaust history, Friedman and Trunk fashioned a vigorous defense in studying the many impediments to Jewish resistance, and Dvorzhetsky created a daring offense in redefining resistance to expand its scope from the limited instances of armed revolt to the widespread efforts of the unarmed Jewish masses to remain alive under German occupation. Regarding the accusation that Jews, quote, went as sheep to the slaughter, Blumenthal responded, "Are sheep not a symbol of purity and innocence? And when slaughterers lead the sheep into the slaughterhouse, are the slaughterers or the sheep guilty?" For these historians, the Holocaust became a new period of Jewish history, admittedly more frightful and painful, but one to be investigated with the same methods and research agenda as prior periods. Choosing to write in Yiddish about the Holocaust served the vital purpose of retaining a close connection both with the murdered subjects of their research and with the survivor audience who considered them uniquely capable of answering the urgent questions of their shared experience. Returning to the original question, why read Jewish history in Yiddish? It is in Yiddish that these historians reveal their priorities for using the past to support the existence of a Yiddish-speaking nation in the present. Not surprisingly, the priorities of Jewish historians differed by language. The telling comparisons are between works in Yiddish and Polish, whether before or after the Holocaust. Works in both languages emphasize Jewish autonomy and Jewish-Christian relations, and both use history to argue for Jewish rights on the basis of the age of Jewish settlement and Jewish contributions to the economy. But Polish writing more often leans toward political and economic history, while Yiddish writing focuses more on cultural and social history. Especially notable is that studies of fixed artifacts, such as buildings, monuments, cemeteries, and the physical aspects of Jewish quarters, are chiefly found in Polish, consistent with a Poland-centered approach to Jewish history. While portable cultural expressions such as literature, theater, and communications are more common in Yiddish, consistent with a pan-Ashkenazi approach to Jewish history. In the early post-war period, Holocaust research in Polish focused more on German crimes, while works in Yiddish concentrated almost exclusively on Jewish life and resistance. These distinctions hold true between historians as well as within a given historian's works in Polish and Yiddish. There are also topics that appear first and perhaps only in Yiddish. Pre-Holocaust examples include Ginsburg's discussion of the Jewish postal service in Tsarist Russia during the Napoleonic Wars that ran more quickly and reliably than the government postal service, and Mahler's revelation that the supposedly beneficent Council of the Four Lands devoted only an infinitesimal proportion of its budget to social welfare, less than 1%. Post-Holocaust examples include Dvorzhetsky's pioneering plea for recognition of unarmed forms of Jewish resistance, and Friedman's overview of the educational programs for survivors in the displaced persons camps of post-war Germany. Historians who wrote in Yiddish could be assured of addressing an exclusively Jewish audience with a special attachment to Jewish history and Yiddish culture, expressed at times subtly, at times overtly, by a sense of shared history and destiny. Most of these nuances translate adequately into English, so that one may indeed read Jewish history in Yiddish, in English, which is the principal purpose of my translation project. Yet there is also the problem of the untranslatable. In writings on the Holocaust, for example, one finds the expression Hitler's treffende Maul. Simply translated, it is Hitler's unkosher mouth, which conveys almost nothing of the meaning. For Yiddish-speaking survivors, the very presence of Hitler's name in a post-war Yiddish work is a triumph of survival that would go unnoticed in English translation. The meaning of Maul is aptly conveyed by mouth, but the problem lies in treffendem, from the everyday word treif, meaning unclean, forbidden, not kosher. In English, the phrase Hitler's unkosher mouth is at best a trivial curse. In Yiddish, treif conveys scorn, revulsion, bitterness, and of course, powerlessness to alter the course of evil. Yet remarkably, by means of this homey and familiar word, evil is domesticated. And that is what cannot be translated. Unlike many translation projects, mine is not intended to supplant the original writings, but to open the door to a less explored cultural world. Perhaps it will find readers who are moved to encounter Yiddish historical writing in its original language. Now, a few words about the book itself. The anthologies of Yiddish literature that have appeared continuously since the early 20th century, both in Yiddish and in English translation, could form the core collection of an ample library of Yiddish works ranging from prose and poetry to plays, essays, folklore, and memoirs. But the shelf reserved for historical scholarship would hold only expectation. Fulfilling that expectation is, at least in part, my hope. Such an anthology of Yiddish historical writing has no precedent, whether in English or in Yiddish. It may well have no precedent in the history of any people or language. Yiddish presents a unique confluence of circumstances that both demand and enable such a retrospective. A populace widely literate in its ancestral language, a nascent nationalist movement, and a recently professionalized cadre of historians motivated to produce secular scholarship in the popular vernacular, followed by the relatively rapid decline of each of those circumstances. In less than a century, Yiddish historical scholarship produced dozens of books and thousands of articles that might today be called a closed canon, yet to be canonized. There is no list of Yiddish historical works widely recognized as essential texts. I have attempted to select as many pieces as possible that I believe should be considered uniquely significant, and which, for this purpose, convey a concise point or story in a manner likely to be accessible to the non-specialist. More than a sampler that displays disparate pieces, the intended result is a mosaic that attempts to present an image, however rough, of the field of Yiddish historical work as it was envisioned by its creators. The 6 topic areas of this anthology are the categories into which the majority of the Yiddish historians' writings seem naturally to fall. I call them Jewish autonomy, on the Jewish street, in the non-Jewish world, Yiddish literature, press, post, and communications, and lastly, education. Nevertheless, I am aware that the resulting image is inevitably an invitation to see the field as I have come to understand it. Yiddish historical work ultimately embraced two moods: hope and loss, building and then consoling a nation. Both moods are incorporated into this anthology, without interruption, which is the manner adopted by the Yiddish historians of the Holocaust. Their writings stress continuity, both of their own lives and of the community. Friedman's bibliography of his own works, for example, merely skips a few blank years between his studies of pre-war Jewish history and his writings on the Holocaust. These historians' research on life in the Jewish ghettos traces the ongoing political, economic, social, cultural, and religious trends that prevailed before the German invasion. Accordingly, each of the topic areas begins with earlier centuries and concludes with writings on the Holocaust. To avoid the usual dilemma of choosing between depth and breadth, I have aimed for depth within breadth by adopting a specific geographic boundary. In the interest of thematic unity, coverage is limited to the Yiddish-speaking heartland of Eastern Europe. To do justice to other locations, entire volumes could be devoted to Yiddish historians' studies of new immigrant communities in Western Europe, the United States, Latin America, and elsewhere in the Yiddish-speaking diaspora. Selecting the works for translation required two layers of review, both because the Yiddish historians did not live in the age of peer review, and because much new research has since appeared. Their principal forum for comment arose only after a work had been published, in the lively and often critical literature of published reviews. Commenced as correctives, such reviews often became original scholarly works of their own. The first layer of review has therefore been to avoid works whose fundamental conclusions would have been rejected by peer reviewers in their own time. An example is the chapter on Jewish antiquities in Ignaz Schipper's Cultural History of Jews in Poland During the Middle Ages, published in 1926, in which he claims that certain old synagogues demonstrate that, quote, among Jews there was no lack of accomplished architects who realized their ideas in the form of monumental Gothic buildings, end quote. A problem of both logic and fact, as it was well known that urban Polish synagogues, like many Polish churches, were often designed by Italian Christian architects. Aware that Schipper has been praised and also criticized for his deductive leaps, I chose selections from his works that were either closely sourced, as in his piece on Jewish autonomy, or reviewed approvingly by his contemporaries, as in a piece on Yiddish theater. The second layer of review has been to avoid works in which a basic assumption has been refuted by more recent scholarship. Although mindful that any work may become dated a century later, I have tried to avoid works that would now be considered unreliable or obsolete. An example is the long history of writings that assume the existence of a Jewish Spielmann, a wandering bard presumed to have performed medieval and early modern Yiddish epic works, analogous to the German Christian Spielmann. This error, apparently originating in an assumption by the lesser-known scholar Leo Landau in 1912, received approval from a chain of eminent so-called peer reviewers, including Schipper, Max Erich, and Max Weinreich, who expanded it in their own works until the theory was ultimately disproved by later scholars. Therefore, among the articles on Old Yiddish literature that I have translated, there are none that reflect the Spielmann theory. On the contrary, Israel Zinberg indicates his skepticism about the theory as he emphasizes instead the Jewish origins of Old Yiddish texts. Examples of the public reception of the Yiddish historians' works are found in the final section of the book, which offers book reviews by contemporary figures in the world of Yiddish letters. To a perhaps surprising degree, their responses as non-professional observers confirm the historians' intentions, whether stated or implicit, to discover and present the formative history of a living people, drawing where possible on Jewish sources of information, for an audience of educated lay readers, to help in building and fortifying a Yiddish-speaking nation, and when all was lost, to console its surviving remnant. Ultimately, my purpose is to provide more than a vehicle for bringing old scholarship to new readers. It is a memorial to a scholarly endeavor, was es nicht mehr, that exists no more, to use a common Yiddish phrase for losses sustained, that I hope will find renewed life with a new audience, both in translation and by opening a door to the Yiddish original writings. To conclude, I would like to share with you the background story of today's talk, in particular the reason it seems so oddly timed, well after the first book was published and well before the second will appear. The new anthology represents more than 20 years of collecting and considering the selections to translate. When it was finally ready, I turned first to my previous publisher, Wayne State University Press, which had done splendid work with the first book, and then to other academic publishers. All responded similarly, that the project was, quote, admirable, but did not have a market. I can only say they are unaware of the partisans for this type of learning. The publisher who has accepted the book is Academic Studies Press. Series editor Michael Berenbaum is enthusiastic and is including the book in their Holocaust series. But this is a press that requires an advance subvention to cover their costs. I was assured by other historians who have published with them that this is becoming increasingly common in academic publishing, and that it is a recognized peer review press. At first, I thought it would be simplest to pay the subvention myself, but I had a vision that has proved to be a reality. Why not involve the community? My best response to those doubting publishers would be to gather a group of sponsors who believe in the work and can be listed as partners in sharing this little-known source of Jewish knowledge. One of my first calls was to Miri Korel, whom I have known in Yiddish circles here in Los Angeles for many years. She confirmed at once that Cycle would serve as a sponsor and referred me to 2 other groups who did the same. But there was a catch to her offer. Would I be good enough to sing for my supper, so to speak, and sooner rather than later? Therein lies the timing of my talk today. And then it was today's Toronto host, Vivian Felsen, who referred me to the Toronto Workman Circle Foundation, whose president, Mel Cederbaum, also graciously informed me that his organization would agree to be a sponsor. I am honored to report that working through all possible contacts, sponsors have now been secured not only for the publication of the book, but also for it to appear in open access, that is to say, free online for the world to read. It will appear in print for libraries and others who wish to buy a paper copy, but no one will need to spend to read these works by the Yiddish historians online. I also have plans to create a website that will host the Yiddish originals of all the works along with other materials. For the record, the book sponsors are Dr. Michael Berenbaum, Central Yiddish Culture Organization, California Institute of Yiddish Culture and Language, Conference on Jewish Material Claims Against Germany, Friends of Jewish Renewal in Poland, Ludwig and Sadie Kahn Chair in Jewish History at UCLA, Memorial Foundation for Jewish Culture, and Toronto Workman Circle Foundation. The principal sponsor for open access is the Claims Conference. And with that, thank you to our hosts today for their invitation, and to you for your attention, and I will be happy to answer any questions.
Mark,
Shikoyach, Mark, thank you so much.
thank you very much. I just wanted to, because of what you just said, and really reminded me that the Toronto Workmen's Circle is one of the sponsors. They are helping to co-sponsor, or they wanted to co-sponsor this event. So I'm glad that you mentioned them, because I neglected to mention them when I spoke earlier. Miri, do you want to say something first? Because I have a few things I would like to say, including the fact that this is a magnificent project that you have undertaken. I'm so in admiration of what you've done, and I think it is so important. And all these figures that you mentioned, and their work, if the fact that it would have been just forgotten had you not translated it and put it into some kind of order. And I really want to say thank you for doing that, and thank you for your talk today. Mary, I'm going to let you say a few words, and I'll have some other comments later.
Yeah, well, I totally echo what Vivian said, and Shikoyach, Mark, really, I think it was a fascinating talk. I know for my students who unfortunately, those that attended, UCLA classes were canceled this past week. So many of the things you're saying, would have gone over their heads, but they would have heard these names, these important names, like Ivo and Ringelboim and so on. And so when we get to this in our classes, they'll have some appreciation, I hope. But what I have for you, I know we have already one question from Henry Slutsky, but before we get to that question, I have a couple of questions that might spark more questions from our participants, which is that, is there anything that you've included in this book that was particularly surprising or even shocking, among these writers in terms of what they said?
Oh, first of all, can you hear me all right?
Yes.
All right. Um, the whole world of it was surprising and shocking. I had no idea until I began to read them in depth that this was an entire enterprise of people engaged in trying to create a history of a people that had not really been told. Surprises? Well, I don't know. Saul Ginsberg is one of my favorites. I mentioned his article on the Jewish Postal Service in Tsarist Russia. He also has a wonderful article on Jewish bandits and highwaymen in Russia. He says, gone are the days when Jews were frightened by every every sound and afraid of every blow. And we're proud that there are Jews today who know how to deliver a blow. And this was written, in the early 20th century, and about a time 100 years earlier than that he's referring to. It's an inside view of Jewish history that's very partisan. It's very professional in the sense of being objective, in the sense of not slanting facts, not putting your thumb on the scale, but there's no lack of emotion to it. And I think one other surprise would be Elias Cherikover's history of the pogroms in Ukraine in the early years after World War I is considered by many historians to be the most balanced, the least provocative, and the least biased of all the accounts, in which he finds not simply that there were people who hated Jews and went to kill them, but that there were historical and economic reasons why there were such riots, that the populace at large was extremely heavily armed right after World War I, having come back from the battlefields with their weapons to find an economy in total collapse, and that all goods and materials were in the hands of the urban populace and the urban shopkeepers, who, as it happens, were all Jews. And that when they went to attack and loot, it was the Jews that they happened to go after, but that they were not necessarily attacking them for being Jews. And that he rather courageously says this in the 1920s. So there are many examples of things you didn't expect, and particularly so in the Holocaust period too. These historians, as I say, were interested in Jewish survival and the will to survive, and above all else, in finding merit in the attempts to survive without arms through all the everyday acts of resilience.
Yes, that aspect has received a lot more attention, right? Not just from, and it's interesting. Recently from more recent historians and others who, who investigate and study the Holocaust. So it's interesting to note that this was already something that Yiddish historians had emphasized and researched even. So that's important
I may
and
add simply
great
that
to know.
Mark Dvorzhetsky began writing on that theme in 1946. and it only percolated into English in the 70s. But the Yiddish historians were the ones who pioneered in this in the 40s and 50s, that it's only by translation that their influence finally came to be felt. And it was because of their influence. For example, if you take even for active resistance, the famous book by Bermark, They Fought Back. It consists of English translations of works, many of which were in Yiddish from 20 years earlier. And it's all just a time lag getting it from the Yiddish into the English. So go ahead.
Yeah.
Well, I have a question that I'd like to ask, because you mentioned about Raful Mahler being a Marxist. And I'm just wondering how that influenced his writing and how he was received because of that.
I'll answer the second part first. He was received with skepticism in some quarters. Those who were not Marxists simply took it as a given that what he had to say was his view and wouldn't be altered by collisions with opposing views. He even wrote a Marxist-oriented history of the Jews. He wrote it in Hebrew, but several volumes, starting with the first, were translated into Yiddish in the 1970s. He took a class-conscious view of Jewish history, and he emphasized things that others overlooked. It's very true that where certain scholars saw the old Polish Council of the Four Lands as being a well-intentioned Jewish autonomy, he saw it as simply an oppression of plutocracy against the masses. And you can argue both sides of that. There is truth to both. And his view was with a certain merit, but it also simply had its blinders that, as you can expect, he took a rather extreme position at times. On the other hand, he was not ever pro-Soviet. And he went back to Poland after the war, attempted to teach for a short time in post-war Poland, and then left, and ended up in Israel at Tel Aviv University. He was a remarkable figure in terms of being a survivor ahead of the fact. He left Europe in 1937 and came to America, spent the war years writing about the Karaites of all subjects in Yiddish, and saw them as an economic class of protest against traditional Judaism and Jews at that time. And then he wrote a very, very interesting essay in the early 50s, or I guess late 40s, early 50s, when he was going to abandon Yiddish largely for Hebrew, explaining all his reasons why Hebrew would be the language of the Jewish future and paving the way for settling in Israel. So he made himself sort of uniquely nimble in staying ahead of trouble, whereas other Yiddish historians like Yankov Shatsky stuck with Yiddish to the end of his life and regretted it terribly. In fact, he said, I think if I quote it right, he said, my people are dead, my subject is dead, and I am dead tired. And staying with Yiddish worked, however, perfectly well for Yeshaya Trunk, but he learned to publish in English. His Lodge Ghetto was a great work, but it wasn't translated into English until 2006, long after his death. Whereas his Judenrat, which was written in English, was published only in Yiddish and became world famous and won him every prize, including the National Book Award. So the lesson learned was Yiddish is fine in its quarters, but it is very, very circumscribing.
Yeah. So we appear to have a number of very fascinating questions from participants, if I may, Vivian. So the first one really was from Henry Slisky, who you know, Mark, very well.
And I'm delighted to hear that he's watching, and I'm just waiting for you to finish to say more.
Okay. So he's actually questioning why, as a behavioral scientist, as a Yiddishist, why is YIVO considered this wissenschaftliche Organisatie rather than Kenschaft, because they're clearly not a scientific organization. Is this something you can respond to? Like, how do they come up with Wissenschaft versus Kenschaft? Science,
Wissenschaft,
for those science versus knowledge.
well, all right. First, I will digress to say that behind me here on the shelf, I can point to it, but I don't want to get up, is a very fine volume that I was given by Henry Slitsky, which is the one and only volume published of Lodger Wissenschaftliche Schriften by Yivo, published in 1938. There would have been more if there had been more years. And the editor was Philip Friedman. It's rare to have an original copy of it, and I do have, thanks to Henry. And I think the answer to the question comes actually into the translation of Wissenschaft. In Yiddish, Wissenschaft is both science and scholarship. There is no other word for scholarship. And the same as in German. It's a dreadful decision to have to make every time you're translating and someone uses the word Wissenschaft, because you never know for sure if they mean science or just more generally scholarship. And you have to choose. In English, we're blessed with more words than Yiddish, and we have more choices. But as a result, when Yivo created its name, or when the name was created for Yivo, they meant scholarship in the broadest sense, and including social sciences, including probably some degree of natural sciences, but absolutely the more social aspects of inquiry. History was only one. They had economics, they had literature and language and philology. So they meant it to be the most inclusive. And that's the best answer I can give to your question.
That's great, Mark. Actually, that helps explain things for me as well. Who always had the same question in mind. So thank you so much. Vivian, would you like to pose the next one from you're muted. You're muted.
I was just going to agree with what Mark had to say, that people often think that Wissenschaft refers only to science, but it doesn't. You can have a wissenschaftliche Arbeit about art, about literature, and so on. But there is a question here: when will this book be available, open source, and how can we find out when it's available?
Well, again, I'll answer the second part first. If your viewers are attuned to you, then I will see that you know when it's available and you can let them know. Now, to the first question, optimistically, very late this year, but it could easily be in the very first part of next year. I am still working on the translations. I will be very open to say that I am now on number 33 out of 49. And they take a few days each. And there will be editing and polishing and reviewing of all of this to make sure that it's as accurate as it can be. And then the publisher says they need about 9 months to produce the book. So it's going to be end of the year or maybe a day later.
Okay, I don't see any other questions here, Mary. Do you?
Yes. So aside from getting big thanks, by the way, Mark, for your talk. So an interesting question from Paulette is, can you describe the ways that the Jewish or Yiddish writing historians falsified their research to hide from Stalinist persecution?
Oh, well,
That's probably a big topic.
Right.
Yeah.
It's a huge topic. It's outside of this one, but I will be happy to answer a bit. The two ways. Number one, after World War II, with the increasing problem of Stalinization and communist hegemony in post-war Poland, the Polish government was interested principally in confronting the West and reducing Western influence in Poland. And so they eliminated all help and cooperation and assistance that was being given to Jewish scholars from the West and forced them to rely on the Polish government. For example, they took the Central Jewish Historical Commission, converted it into the Jewish Historical Institute, and said that to preserve its independence, it would be incorporated into the official Polish Historical Society. I can't remember the exact name. And of course, that is what you would call Stalinist doublespeak, because their independence was completely taken away. The party line was that World War II was won and the Jews were saved solely by the communist Soviet Union, and that resistance in all the Jewish ghettos and among Jews in general was only by the communist Jews, aided by fictitious assistance from outside communists in the Soviet bloc. And writings like Ber Mark, who wrote on the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising, metamorphosed from one edition to the next to the next. In the first edition, he talks about each of the Jewish groups in the Warsaw Ghetto, the Zionists, the Bundists, the communists, the various socialists, and each of their contributions. And by the time you get to the last edition of his book, there is only the communists. And all the others are simply taken out of the story. That's one of the falsifications. Another is that because Poland quite rightly wanted to not remain an anti-Semitic government, an officially anti-Semitic governing state, and quite rightly to make Jews part of the polity, they suppressed anything in Jewish writings about World War II that would have cast a bad light on Poles. And they rewrote or excerpted Ringelblum's writings from the Warsaw Ghetto and his writings about Poles and Jews together to eliminate any criticism of Poles and to show only that Poles were universally helpful and saving Jews during the Holocaust, which God knows they were. But they made it into a one-sided story instead of a full-sided story. Those are two examples.
Well, this is still going on today, as we know, right?
Oh, yes, yes. And I should add that they created a line in which, with a series of hyphenations, they connected American imperialism, British imperialism, the Judenrat, and all evil forces in the ghetto in such a manner that only the communists came out shining, but all other parties in all the ghettos were seen as somehow being manipulated by worldwide capitalist powers against the Jews. It was simply absurd, but it was communism of that era.
This is such a fascinating discussion. I think we could just go on and on and on. All these things are so interesting, but it's already past 3:15, and I think that we're going to have to close here. But thank you so much, really. Again, it was just absolutely fascinating.
And I just want to say there is another question, but we'll have to pass it on to Mark. Rosa, we will pass your question on to Mark and he can respond to you directly.
Right.
Yeah, because yeah, we could spend many more hours. I have many more questions for you, but we do have to close our session. So yeah, so herzlichen Dank. Thank you so much, Shekoyach, Mark, and thank you to Vivian and Sharon again, and everyone, all of you who have attended today, whether you're local in Los Angeles, dealing with what we're dealing with, or elsewhere in the country, in the world. Thank you so much for being here with us today.
Thank you, Neri, and
Thank you for inviting me.
thank you.